In the Western Hemisphere, there was a clash of civilizations between the United States and Latin America. It's described quite revealingly in the internal record, which we now have. It came to a head in February 1945, so at the time of Yalta, when the war was almost over and about carrying out the post-war planning. Recall, as I said, Britain and France were kicked out. They had been the major powers in South America, but their day was over. The problem was that the Latin Americans had their own ideas, which were contrary to our ideas, and that's the clash of civilizations. It came to a head in a hemispheric conference that was held in Chapultepec, Mexico in February 1945, and where the U.S. was trying to institute what it called a Charter for the Americas, and the Latin American countries were very much opposed. They were under the sway of what the State Department, this is internal documents, what it called the philosophy of the new nationalism, which held that the prime beneficiaries of a country's resources should be the people of that country, quoting, and that development should be based on domestic needs and should aim at broad distribution and development. And the United States was totally opposed to that. U.S. policy is that the prime beneficiaries of a country's resources are foreign investors, not the people of that country, and that independent development was unacceptable. There must be what was called complementary development complementary to the interests of U.S. private power. So, for example, Brazil, a potentially rich, very rich country, was allowed to develop the steel industry, but only those aspects of steel that U.S. steel corporations didn't want to produce, like, cheap, low-tech steel, but not high-tech, because that wouldn't be complementary. And the U.S. won, of course, given the power relations. So the philosophy of the new nationalism was beaten back. The prime beneficiaries of Latin America's resources are American U.S. investors and their own little wealthy sector that works with them. There is no independent development. There's no attempt at broader distribution of wealth. And in fact, you can read the World Bank year after year where they deplore the fact that Latin America has the worst economic inequality in the world, but nobody would be so unkind as to trace that fact back to the clash of civilizations in 1945 and the policies that were then carried out to keep it that way, often with brutal intervention, I should say, and murderous military dictatorships and so on, particularly starting from the Kennedy period. Anyhow, how about domestically inside the United States? Recall that there had been a Great Depression in the 1930s, and any lingering illusions that capitalism might be a viable system had disappeared. Nobody had any such illusions. The question was what to do about it. Well, the New Deal measures had very limited effect. You take a look around 1939, things were sort of softer, but people maybe were a little more hopeful, but the basic economic problems were about the same. On the other hand, the war got over. The war overcame the problems, got the country out of depression, into industrial production zoomed, private power zoomed, and everybody knew how it had been done. It had been done by funneling public funds through state power into the hands of private industry, and that worked. And then came the post-war period, the wartime, the war production system declined. There was a lot of pent-up. People saved a lot of money by working, and they hadn't been able to spend it, so it was possible for a couple of years to sort of keep the thing going on consumption. But by around 1948 or so, 47 or 48, there was a lot of fear that the country was going to head right back to the Depression. And the way to get around it was to restore the role of state power in funneling public funds into the pockets of wealthy people. That's what it amounts to. And they also knew the best way of doing it, namely the Pentagon. And that was understood. There's nothing here. You don't have to go to secret records. If you go to the business press in the late 1940s, it discusses all of this quite openly. And if you go over to Steel Magazine or the Magazine of Wall Street, they pointed out that military funding would be the magic elixir that would keep the system going for endless good times. Business Week was very concerned that Stalin's peace offensives might be, that Washington might be unable to resist them, but they were pleased that they were able to resist them. They said, Washington resists the peace offensives, we can keep the military spending going. And it was perfectly understood. There was no subterfuge that this is the way to maintain the private enterprise economy. The first Secretary of the Air Force, Stuart Symington, later became known as a senator from Boeing when he moved over to the Senate. He described his role in the state as Secretary of the Air Force to be to ensure that adequate military procurement funds go to Boeing, and he explained publicly, incidentally, that the word to use is not subsidy, the word to use is security. And in other words, you can sort of fool people into being frightened. You can get them to transfer public funds over to the hands of private industry. In the 1950s, research and development in electronics was about 85% public funded. In computers, it was about 100% public funded, either through the Pentagon or through the Department of Energy or later NASA, which was Kennedy's innovation about trying to figure out a way to get the public to pay for the costs of private profit. That's one reason why the Pentagon system doesn't decline with the end of the Cold War. Nobody knows any alternative way of doing it. Economists can figure out technical alternatives, but they're irrelevant. If you take an economics course, as Keynes pointed out, you can bury dollars in the sand and it'll also funnel funds into the economy. However, economists don't look at another problem, and that is they have different power consequences. And business did look at those consequences. So if you read, say, Business Week in the late 1940s, they were well aware as the economic scientists, that there were a lot of different ways of getting the government to pour public funds into maintaining the economy, but they much preferred military spending, and they explained why. There's a problem with social spending. Social spending has a democratizing effect. People care about where there's a hospital or a road or something like that. They have no opinions about what kind of jet fighter to build. So they don't get involved. They just leave it to somebody else. And if that jet fighter happens to subsidize the advanced sectors of industry, well, okay, then we're doing it on the sly. Furthermore, social spending tends to have a redistributive effect, whereas military spending concentrates private power and profit in high-tech corporations, managerial sectors, investment banks, some skilled workers and managers, and so on. So it has a counter-redistributive effect. If the government's involved in the production of anything useful, say, it interferes with private profit. On the other hand, if the government is just producing waste, which is, from an economic point of view, what military goods are, just waste, basically, and furthermore, rapidly obsolescing waste, because you have to keep replacing it all the time. If the government's producing rapidly obsolescing waste, that's a gift to the corporate manager. It doesn't interfere with profit. Also, it happened to be very well geared at that point to the needs of the industrial economy. The industrial economy, if you think about how it was developing at the time, around, say, electronics and computers and all, various, the sectors of high tech that were on the cutting edge happened to be very close to the ones that were directly related to military production. So what you had, the Pentagon system was almost perfect welfare system. Enhanced private power, enhanced undermined democracy, had a counter-redistributive effect. Just a gift to the corporate manager. The purchasing may not be a large percentage, but was like a cushion for spending, which makes a big difference. And research and development, the costs were paid by the public, and then the profit went over to the private sector. And that system remains coming up to the present. That's our current system.